A teenage girl was dragged out of her school for wearing a hijab. The world watched and said nothing until she stood before a courtroom filled with critics, cameras, and a prosecutor ready to tear her faith apart. But what happened next stunned everyone. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't flinch. She spoke and the courtroom fell silent. Even the judge blinked back tears. This wasn't just a legal battle. It became a moment that exposed what freedom really means. What did this girl say that made a nation stop and question everything? If you're ready to witness a truth the world tried to silence, press 1 to begin. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, activists, skeptics, and cameras pointed like rifles. On the front bench sat Lena Amin, 16 years old, her white hijab neatly folded and pinned beneath her chin. She was small, almost swallowed by the grandeur of the high ceiling and oak panel walls. Yet despite the storm outside, she sat still, shoulders straight, fingers gently resting on her lap. Quran tucked quietly in her bag. This wasn't just another legal case. This was war over identity. Headlines all week had screamed, "Hijab girl challenges the Republic, framing her as defiance wrapped in cloth." The opposing counsel, Marcel Dupont, a celebrated secularist and courtroom showman, had already spoken to the press. The veil is not freedom, it's indoctrination. Now he stood tall at the prosecutor's table, projecting confidence. "Your Honor," he declared, "this trial isn't about one girl, it's about preserving our national values." The audience murmured, some nodding, others frowning. His voice echoed through the hall like a verdict already made. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s, turned her gaze to Lena. "Miss Amin," she said, "you may speak now if you wish." Lena stood. A hush fell. No one expected anything remarkable from the teenager. Some prepared to roll their eyes, but Lena's voice, though soft, cut through the courtroom like a thread through silk. "I didn't come here to defy a country," she said. "I came here to defend a choice." And just like that, the balance in the room shifted. Something had cracked, not loudly, but unmistakably. A collision had begun, not of laws or politics, but of truth and perception. And Lena was no longer just a girl in a scarf. She was a voice the world had not yet prepared for. A murmur rippled through the courtroom like static before a storm. Lena's voice was calm, but her presence startled the room. She didn't fit the mold they had built in their minds: a rebellious teen, a mouthpiece for religious patriarchy, a symbol of political resistance. She was poised, articulate, respectful, and that alone disarmed them more than any protest could. The prosecutor, Marcel Dupont, narrowed his eyes and leaned slightly forward, his lips curled with condescension. "Mademoiselle," he said loud enough for the room to hear, "we commend your courage, but let us be honest. You are 16? Do you truly understand the implications of what you wear? Or are you simply repeating what you've been told?" Laughter scattered softly from his supporters seated behind him, but Lena didn't waver. She stepped forward, hands still at her sides. "I wasn't told to wear it. She said I asked to." At 12, the judge raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "I wore it the first time when I realized my worth didn't need to be measured by how much of me the world could see, that I could be heard without being exposed, that I could carry faith not as a chain, but as a crown." Several in the audience stiffened. This wasn't defiance, it was conviction, and it was graceful. Marcel folded his arms. "You say that now, but many girls your age are pressured by family, by community, by men. Doesn't your hijab represent that control?" Lena looked him in the eyes. "Control isn't wearing a scarf. Control is being told I can't." Silence. A few journalists shifted in their seats. Pens suddenly stilled. She turned to the audience, speaking with quiet strength. "When a nun covers her head, we call it devotion. When a Jewish woman wears a tichel, we call it tradition. When a Muslim girl wears hijab, we call it oppression." Why, no one answered. "My hijab doesn't erase me. It protects my space in a world that constantly tries to define me. And when my school expelled me for it, they didn't free me, they silenced me." The judge, previously expressionless, now leaned forward slightly. Marcel, sensing the shift, interrupted. "But secularism demands neutrality. Aren't you bringing religion into a place where it doesn't belong?" Lena's reply came without pause. "I'm not asking the state to wear hijab. I'm asking it to let me be who I am without punishment." She glanced around the courtroom. "I am French, I speak your language, I know your laws, I respect your constitution. But must I strip part of myself to belong to you?" In the back, an elderly woman clutched her rosary. A university professor beside her lowered his gaze. Lena's voice lowered to a whisper. "You ask if I understand what this scarf means." "Yes, monsieur, I do. It means faith, it means freedom, and today it means courage." She returned to her seat beside her mother, who silently reached over and squeezed her hand. Neither smiled. They didn't need to. The weight of what had just happened was still settling. The courtroom sat stunned, not by drama or emotion, but by clarity. Marcel Dupont tapped his notes nervously. The script he had prepared no longer matched the reality before him, because the girl they thought wouldn't matter had just shaken the room, and the trial wasn't just about hijab anymore. It was about whether a country built on freedom could recognize it when it was wrapped in cloth. The prosecutor rose with visible irritation. Marcel Dupont wasn't used to losing ground, especially not to someone so young. He cleared his throat theatrically, pacing slowly in front of the jury, as if building tension would erase the shift that had just taken place. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "do not be seduced by poetry. Yes, Miss Amin speaks beautifully, but beneath her eloquence lies a dangerous precedent." He held up a printed photograph of Lena from the day she was escorted off school grounds. Her hijab crisp, her face composed, surrounded by uniformed officers. "This is not about expression," he declared. "It is about encroachment." The hijab, whether worn by choice or not, symbolizes a belief system that is incompatible with secular institutions. He turned toward Lena without directly facing her, as if she were now a concept, not a person. "France cannot bend its laws every time someone invokes faith. Our classrooms must remain neutral, free from ideology, from division, from political symbols." Lena watched him quietly. Her eyes didn't flinch, but her fingers folded tighter in her lap. Marcel paused, eyes sweeping the room, gauging reactions. "You say hijab is a choice? But what of the girls who feel forced? What of those who suffer under regimes that require it? How can we differentiate between true choice and learned obedience?" He let the words linger, confident that doubt had been cast. Then Lena stood again. She didn't ask. She simply rose, and the judge gave a subtle nod. "I agree," she said to everyone's surprise. "We must protect those who are forced, just as we must protect those who choose." The courtroom stilled. If a woman is forced to remove her hijab, that's oppression. If she's forced to wear it, that's also oppression. But if she chooses it freely without pressure and is still punished, that is injustice. Marcel's lips tightened. Lena walked forward slowly, her voice firm but never raised. "We speak of neutrality. But what is neutral about telling a girl she can show her hair, her skin, her body, but not her beliefs?" She gestured toward her scarf. "If I wore this for fashion, I would be celebrated. If I wore it as a cultural accessory, I would be applauded. But because I wear it as a symbol of faith, I am told to remove it." Her eyes swept across the room, locking briefly with the judge's. True neutrality protects all choices, not just the ones that fit into comfort zones. Marcel took a step forward, trying to interrupt. "But your presence makes others uncomfortable. Children should not be exposed to such overt religious symbols." Lena tilted her head unfazed. "So we silence people not for what they say or do, but for what they wear. What does that teach the next generation? That peace means hiding who you are." A quiet murmur rose from the back benches. Reporters scribbled faster. Lena continued, "I am not a walking threat. I'm a daughter, a student, a citizen. I love books. I cry at sad movies. I want to be a lawyer. My scarf does not erase my humanity. It reflects my relationship with my creator." The judge leaned back slowly in her chair, eyes no longer on the lawyer's bench, but on the girl who had just redefined the courtroom. Marcel opened his mouth to speak, but for the first time, nothing came out, because the argument wasn't hers anymore. It belonged to the truth she carried with grace, logic, and unshakable sincerity. The weight in the room had shifted. What began as a court hearing now felt more like a reckoning of conscience, of freedom of identity. Reporters had lowered their pens. The camera crew barely blinked. Even the security guards at the back had relaxed their posture, as if something greater than law was being articulated through the soft, unwavering voice of a teenage girl. Lena remained at the center of it, not elevated, not defiant, but dignified. She had not raised her voice once, and yet every word echoed. She turned back to the judge. "May I share something personal?" she asked. The judge nodded slowly, hands folded under her chin. Lena took a breath. "When I was 13, I decided to wear the hijab full-time. Not because my parents told me to, but because I was tired of being defined by my hair, by my clothes, by boys whispering behind me in the hallway." Her voice faltered slightly, then steadied again. "I wanted to reclaim myself, to say, I choose how you see me." The hijab wasn't a wall, it was a mirror. A way to remind myself every morning that my worth is not in the image, but in the soul. Someone in the audience gasped quietly. My teacher called me brave that day, but a year later that same school suspended me, said I was disrupting the learning environment, as if covering myself was more offensive than the way others stared when I didn't. The courtroom was silent, not out of agreement, but reflection. "Do you know what hurt most?" she asked. It wasn't being told I was wrong. It was being told I didn't understand my own freedom, that my faith made me unfit to learn, that I could only be accepted if I erased a part of myself. At that, the elderly woman who had earlier clutched her rosary now reached for a tissue. She wasn't Muslim, she didn't wear hijab, but something in Lena's voice had touched a place untouched by dogma. Her dignity, Marcel Dupont shifted in his seat. The legal team beside him whispered nervously, scribbling, no longer confident in their optics. Lena looked at the room now, not as a defendant, but as a mirror. "You ask if I was brainwashed? I say maybe we all are. Maybe we've been trained to fear what we don't understand. Maybe we're taught to confuse conformity with freedom. And maybe, just maybe, removing someone's right to choose isn't neutral. It's oppression dressed as policy." A soft cough broke the stillness. Then another. Not out of disrespect, but the sound of people returning to their bodies after being emotionally suspended. She gave one final sentence, her voice almost a whisper. "I didn't come here to make anyone Muslim. I came to ask if I respect your right to be you. Why can't you respect mine to be me?" As she stepped back, the judge looked down, blinking slowly as though processing more than testimony. She wasn't just weighing a case, she was witnessing a moment that might one day be called historic. Outside, hundreds watched the live stream. Hashtags were already trending. But inside, no one reached for their phones. No one moved to applaud because they all understood something had just happened. A turning point, not in law. In hearts, Marcel Dupont sat rigid in his chair, a forced smile tugging at the edge of his lips. He had spent his entire legal career defending secularism, his version of it, at least clean, orderly, controlled. His words had always been sharp, persuasive, soaked in the confidence of applause and precedent. But now, under the gentle weight of Lena's truth, they felt hollow, decorative, almost fragile. He rose slowly. He needed to reclaim control, to remind the courtroom of his authority. "Your Honor," he began, adjusting his jacket. "Let us not forget the bigger picture. We are not here for poetry or sentimentality. We are here to uphold the law." His voice was steady, but the power behind it had thinned. He looked directly at Lena. "Miss Amin speaks of choice, but she represents something larger. Something that influences young girls to define themselves by their faith, not their intellect. We are not debating her sincerity. We are debating the message her image sends." There it was, the attempt to reframe, to turn Lena from a person into a symbol, to turn empathy into a threat. But this time, even the courtroom didn't react the way he expected. A journalist furrowed her brow. A young man beside her shook his head, and Lena stood once more. This time, she didn't wait to be invited. She walked forward, her hijab radiant under the court's fluorescent lights. "I'm not a billboard," she said gently. "I don't send messages, I live them." Dupont tried to cut in, but the judge raised her hand, silencing him. "I didn't choose Islam over intellect," Lena continued. "I chose Islam because it honored mine." Her voice trembled. "Just for a second, I chose to veil my body, to free my mind, to stop competing in a world where girls are told that beauty equals value." She turned to the gallery, now speaking not as a witness, but as a witness bearer. "If covering my hair provokes this much fear, maybe the problem was never the cloth, but what it represents: a woman who bows to God, not to trends, not to pressure, not to politics." The silence wasn't just respectful now. It was stunned. Dupont swallowed hard. He opened his mouth again but paused. He glanced at the judge, then back at the jury. Their faces no longer mirrored his confidence. And in that moment, the crack appeared. He shifted his weight, his fingers clenched around his pen. His tone, when he finally spoke again, lacked its usual certainty. Well, belief is personal, but society must be protected from the extremes of expression. Lena turned back slowly. If my scarf is extreme, then what do we call forcing a girl to undress to attend school? Dupont had no reply. The judge exhaled quietly, her gaze lingering on Lena. Not as a threat, not as a legal subject, but as a citizen. The prosecutor's ego, once seated high, had slowly begun to erode layer by layer, peeled back not by attack, but by a calm, consistent tide of truth. A courtroom clerk beside the jury whispered, "She's not just defending herself. She's defending all of us." Because in that moment, Lena wasn't just a Muslim girl fighting for her hijab. She had become a mirror reflecting everything society had failed to see in its pursuit of control, disguised as equality. And the man who thought he could define her, he now stood silent, staring at a definition he could no longer challenge. The courtroom air had thickened, not with tension but with revelation. It was as if the walls themselves had leaned in to listen, as if even the judge's gavel dared not interrupt the silence that had settled. Lena remained standing, not as a protester, not even as a plaintiff, but as a soul who had just disarmed an entire institution with nothing but grace, clarity, and faith. The judge sat still, her hands folded under her chin, but her eyes were soft now. The legal formalities had faded. What remained was a human being seeing another beyond law and beyond bias. She cleared her throat and gently asked Miss Amin, "If there's one thing you want this court, this country to understand, what is it?" Lena looked around the courtroom and the cameras, the skeptics, the supporters, the silently weeping strangers, and then she turned to the judge. "That freedom of religion," she said, "means nothing if it ends the moment I step into a classroom." Her voice was steady now, stronger than it had ever been. "I don't ask France to wear my hijab. I ask that France not punish me for wearing it." The judge nodded slowly, but Lena wasn't finished. "I once read about Rosa Parks. She continued how she refused to give up her seat. They told her to move to preserve the comfort of others. But dignity isn't disruptive. It only feels that way when we're used to defining people by power instead of principle." Gasps rippled faintly from the back of the courtroom. One of the jurors pressed her hand to her heart. A man who had earlier rolled his eyes now sat forward, elbows on knees, as if he'd forgotten this was a trial at all. "My hijab," Lena said quietly, "isn't the enemy of France. It's a part of me. A part of me that still believes I belong here." She paused. "But if I have to strip my belief to sit in your schools, then what kind of freedom is that?" The prosecutor, silent now, slowly lowered his pen. He no longer looked ready to speak. He looked ready to listen. Lena stepped back, returning to her seat beside her mother, who grasped her hand with a strength only a mother could give, a strength that said, "You did it, my daughter. You did more than defend your rights. You honored our faith." The judge turned her head toward the opposing bench. "Mr. Dupont," she said, "do you have anything else to add?" He opened his mouth, nothing came out. He blinked once. Then with a quiet exhale, he said, "No, Your Honor." The gallery seemed to exhale with him. Lena hadn't just answered the accusations. She had dismantled the walls of fear with softness. She hadn't raised her voice. She had raised their understanding. And in that moment, what had begun as a trial over a piece of cloth had become something much deeper, a public unlearning of what it meant to be free to be equal and to be truly seen. The courtroom didn't erupt. There were no cheers, no dramatic gestures, but something undeniable had shifted. Not in policy, in hearts. When the verdict was finally read, the words echoed more quietly than expected, but they shook more deeply than anyone in that courtroom could have anticipated. In the matter of Lena Amin versus the National Board of Education, this court finds the expulsion unconstitutional. The right to religious expression as protected under the law shall not be denied in public education on the basis of dress alone. Gasps escaped the crowd, not of shock, but of release. A pressure had lifted. Something unspoken had finally been heard. Lena didn't smile. She simply closed her eyes and whispered, Alhamdulillah. Her mother wept beside her, tears spilling not just for her daughter's victory, but for every woman whose faith had ever been treated like a crime. Reporters rushed out to file their stories. The opposing legal team quietly packed their briefcases. Marcel Dupont lingered, his face unreadable. Not angry, not humiliated, just changed. He turned to Lena as she stood to leave. You didn't debate me, he said quietly. You exposed something I had forgotten. That conviction doesn't always come with noise. Lena nodded, offering only a respectful, thank you for listening. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered. Some were there to support, others out of curiosity, but all of them fell silent as Lena stepped onto the steps. Still wrapped in the same white hijab they had once called provocative cameras. Clicked microphones were shoved toward her. A reporter called out, "Do you feel like you won?" Lena paused, then said softly, "This wasn't about winning. It was about being seen." That clip would go viral before the sun set. By nightfall, the image of Lena standing with her mother outside the courthouse, calm, covered, and victorious, was shared across the globe. Comment sections filled with messages, "I never understood hijab until today." She didn't just defend Islam, she defended human dignity. She gave faith a voice in a place it had been silenced. But not everyone saw the clip. Not everyone shared it. Some quietly took note. Some simply sat with what they heard. In a small school in Lyon, a girl who had stopped wearing hijab out of fear packed it again in her bag for the next morning. In a university classroom in Berlin, a professor replayed Lena's speech and decided to revise a lecture on secularism. And in a modest apartment in Paris, an elderly French woman who had watched the entire trial live now sat with a Quran she had never opened until tonight. Back in her bedroom, Lena knelt in prayer. No crowds, no applause, just quiet gratitude, because she knew this moment wasn't just hers. It belonged to every young Muslim girl who had ever been told to shrink, to hide, to apologize for her faith. It belonged to every soul who ever wondered if truth spoken softly could still change the world. And now they had their answer. It can, it did, and it will again. The story of hijab on trial, the courtroom debate that shocked the world, reminds us that true strength doesn't always come from confrontation. It comes from conviction. Lena's quiet courage teaches us that faith, when rooted in understanding and sincerity, can pierce through even the loudest walls of prejudice. In a world that often rewards conformity and silences, belief, choosing to stand for your values even when misunderstood, is an act of profound bravery. This isn't just a Muslim story, it's a human story. It's about the right to be seen without having to compromise who you are. Lena didn't argue to be right, she spoke to be real, and in doing so, she reminded everyone that freedom is not defined by how much we strip away from ourselves to be accepted, but by how much we're allowed to carry what matters. In life, we will all face moments where silence feels safer, but the real change happens when someone, just one person, chooses to speak with dignity instead of fear. Let that person be you, because your quiet truth, when spoken with sincerity, may be the echo someone else has been waiting to hear. He was one of Jerusalem's most respected rabbis, feared in debates sharp with scripture. The crowd came expecting another easy victory, but then a 10-year-old Muslim boy stepped forward. No one knew his name. He wasn't supposed to speak. Yet within minutes, the entire synagogue fell silent. The rabbi stopped arguing, the audience stopped laughing, and the boy, he spoke not to win, but to awaken something forgotten. What did this child say that made a scholar whisper, "You reminded me how to believe again"? If you're ready to witness the moment, truth shattered pride, and hearts were changed forever, press 1 to begin. The Grand Synagogue Hall in Jerusalem was alive with anticipation. Rows of wooden benches were filled with scholars, students, and families, men in kippahs. Women with covered heads gathered for a highly publicized interfaith event titled Voices of Faith. The marble floors gleamed, cameras rolled, and a low hum of conversation filled the air. At the center stood Rabbi Eliam Rosen, a towering figure in Jewish scholarship and televised debate. He adjusted his robe with confident precision, glasses low on his nose, his face set with the cool certainty of someone who had spent decades shaping arguments and dismantling them. "This is not about division," he said into the microphone, his voice rich and rehearsed. It is about clarity. And clarity demands we question the Quran's claim of continuing revelation. If God gave his word to Moses, what need is there for Muhammad? Applause followed. The audience nodded in agreement. It was supposed to be a clean intellectual exercise. But then, a small figure stirred near the side wall. A young boy stood up. No one had noticed him until now. 10 years old, calm, dressed modestly, holding a small worn copy of the Quran. He raised his hand gently. The room fell still. A few chuckled, some whispered. Rabbi Rosen smirked. "Does the Ummah send children now?" he joked. But the boy stepped forward with serenity. "With your permission," he said softly, "may I respond?" There was laughter at first, then silence, because in that moment it was not about the boy's size. It was about the weight of something unseen, something the rabbi did not yet recognize. Truth was about to speak through innocence. The moderator hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "Let the boy speak." The murmur of the crowd returned, now laced with curiosity, confusion, and not a small amount of skepticism. A few leaned in, intrigued. Others smirked, certain. This would be nothing more than a charming interruption, but as the boy Yusuf walked calmly to the microphone, there was no hesitation in his steps. His Quran, wrapped in an embroidered cloth, hung gently by his side. He stood on a wooden stool provided by the staff so he could reach the mic, then adjusted it with careful hands. "I thank you for the opportunity," Yusuf said, his voice clear, almost delicate, but unnervingly composed. "You asked, Rabbi, why there was a need for Muhammad if God had already revealed the Torah to Moses." Rabbi Rosen crossed his arms and raised an eyebrow, as if waiting to be entertained. Yusuf opened his Quran, flipping pages with precision. In the Torah, he said, God speaks of a prophet to come. In Deuteronomy 18:18, it says, "I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among their brethren, and I will put my words in his mouth." The room quieted. He continued, "Muslims believe that prophet was Muhammad, peace be upon him, and the Quran, like the Torah before it, was not Muhammad's words. It was God's rabbi." Rosen interrupted, his tone still playful. "And yet it contradicts our covenant, our laws." Yusuf didn't flinch. "If two doctors give different prescriptions, it doesn't mean one is false. It means the patient has changed and the guidance has been updated. Islam does not deny the Torah. It confirms it and corrects what has been altered." A rustle moved through the audience. The rabbi squinted, and a child presumes to explain scripture to a rabbi. Yusuf smiled gently. "Not explain, sir, only remind." The moderator glanced at the rabbi, surprised by the boy's poise. But it was the audience that had truly shifted. No longer dismissive, they were now drawn in. The boy's words weren't combative, they were careful, sincere. Yusuf turned another page. "And in the Quran we are told, say, we believe in what was revealed to us and what was revealed to you. Our God and your God is one, and to him we submit." Quran 29:46. He looked up. "We don't see you as our enemies, we see you as our cousins, Ahlul Kitab, people of the book." There was a long pause. Somewhere in the audience, a woman covered her mouth in astonishment. An older man leaned forward, no longer skeptical, but listening, truly listening. Rabbi Rosen was quiet. For a moment he seemed unsure if this was still a debate or if something more was unfolding. Yusuf added one last line, barely louder than a whisper. "I didn't come to win an argument, I came to honor a shared truth." The moderator swallowed hard and looked to the rabbi, who remained still. His arms now uncrossed, his expression unreadable. The synagogue, once filled with prideful certainty, now felt strangely reverent. This boy, this child, had spoken not like a scholar or a zealot, but like someone who had met the truth and carried it like a lamp in his chest. And the flame was starting to flicker in others. Rabbi Eliam Rosen cleared his throat and leaned into the microphone. His voice measured now, but with a hint of edge. Very eloquent, he said, "But let's not romanticize this. Islam denies the covenant given to us at Sinai. Your prophet, peace be upon him, rewrote the story. That's not continuity, that's contradiction." A few murmurs of agreement returned to the crowd. The rabbi had regained some of his footing. He looked directly at Yusuf, confident the boy wouldn't know how to navigate the complexity of Jewish law and historical theology. Yusuf nodded thoughtfully. "May I ask a question, Rabbi?" he said. Rosen smirked. "You may, if the Torah is a covenant," Yusuf asked gently. "Is it only for one people or for all humanity?" Rosen didn't hesitate. "It was given to the children of Israel. That is the nature of our chosenness." Yusuf took a breath. "Then Islam is not a contradiction. It is a continuation, not to erase your covenant, but to open the message to the rest of the world." The audience was still, and Yusuf added softly, "If a new message from the same God reaches other people, is it rejection or mercy?" The rabbi didn't respond, not because he was cornered, but because the framing was so unexpected. It wasn't a challenge, it was an invitation. He quickly recovered. "Fine, but what of your prophet's actions in war? What of the verses in the Quran that call for fighting? What kind of mercy slays with the sword?" This time some in the audience leaned in, waiting to see if the boy would falter, but Yusuf didn't waver. "Sir," he said, "did not Moses command war? Did not Joshua? Did not David fight Goliath?" The rabbi blinked. "The Quran speaks of fighting." Yusuf continued, "Yes, but only when Muslims were attacked, expelled, and persecuted. Never to conquer for power. It says, 'Fight in the way of God, those who fight you but do not transgress.' God does not love the transgressors." Quran 2:190. He turned to the crowd, eyes calm, and the Prophet Muhammad forgave those who stoned him. He showed mercy to those who betrayed him. War was not his mission, revelation was. The rabbi shifted in his seat. "But what of how Islam views Jews?" he pushed. "Surely you cannot deny there are harsh verses." Yusuf opened his Quran again and read, "You will find the closest in affection to the believers are those who say we are Christians, and the most hostile are some of the Jews." He paused, but the verse continues. It says, "Because among them are priests and monks who are not arrogant." Quran 5:82. It doesn't say all Jews. It speaks of those who were unjust, just as your Torah speaks of rebellious tribes and disobedient children of Israel. It's not hate, it's history. The rabbi leaned back. Yusuf closed the Quran gently and said, "We are not enemies, Rabbi. We are witnesses of different pages in the same divine book." The audience was no longer just watching, they were absorbing. Even the rabbi, though still guarded, no longer looked at Yusuf with condescension. Something else had entered his eyes now. Uncertainty, and beneath that, respect. A long silence followed Yusuf's last words. The crowd, once animated and reactive, had settled into a stunned quiet. Something had shifted, not just in tone, but in atmosphere. It no longer felt like a debate. It felt like a lesson, one not from ego or academia, but from sincerity. At the front row, an elderly woman with silver hair, Rabbi Rosen's sister, dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. She hadn't cried in a synagogue since her father's funeral. But something about this boy, the way he spoke of shared revelation, of cousins divided not by belief, but by misunderstanding, pierced through her defenses. Yusuf stepped slightly forward again, never raising his voice, only letting it carry with calm. "I was raised with stories of the prophets," he said. "We love Moses just as we love Muhammad. I memorized Surah Taha when I was 8, which speaks of Musa's mission to Pharaoh. My grandfather told me, never forget Yusuf, our prophet, wept when he recited the words of Moses." He turned toward the rabbi. "If you think we disrespect your tradition, then someone has lied to you about who we are." A deep hush fell again. The moderator, who had been unusually quiet, sat forward in his chair, clearly caught off guard by the emotional weight in the room. A man near the back of the hall, who had previously chuckled at Yusuf's entrance, now sat with folded hands and lowered eyes. Next to him, a teenage yeshiva student whispered, "That's in our Torah too," referring to the verse Yusuf quoted earlier. Rabbi Rosen's fingers tapped rhythmically on the podium. He didn't interrupt, though the impulse was there. He looked out at his audience, his people, and saw something he hadn't expected. They weren't just entertained, they were moved. Yusuf continued, "I'm not asking anyone to change their scripture. I'm asking them to remember what's already in it. That God is one, that arrogance blinds us, and that revelation is not a trophy, it's a trust." Someone in the audience quietly said, "Amen." Rosen's expression flickered, not in anger, not in embarrassment, but in something far more uncomfortable. Recognition, Yusuf turned once more to face the rabbi directly. You said earlier that our book contradicts yours, but I've read yours too. And when I read it, I feel love for Moses, I feel sadness when he's disobeyed, I feel strength when he stands before Pharaoh. Just like I do when our prophet forgives the people of Mecca. He paused, then added, maybe the real contradiction is that we keep fighting over who owns the truth instead of recognizing the truth that owns us. A soft collective exhale swept the room. No one clapped, no one needed to, because everyone there knew something sacred had just been said. Even Rabbi Rosen's posture softened. He looked at the boy now, not as a debater but as a reminder of the humility he once had when he first opened the Torah as a child. The moderator finally found his voice. Perhaps, he said slowly, truth speaks loudest when spoken by those who seek nothing but to share it. The synagogue felt less like a courtroom and more like a sanctuary. And Yusuf, still only 10 years old, stood quietly unaware that the silence around him wasn't weakness, it was awakening. Rabbi Rosen sat perfectly still, his fingers interlocked elbows, resting on the carved wooden armrests of his chair. His mind, however, was not still. It raced through verses he had memorized, debates he had won, and years he had spent warning others of Islam's infiltration. He had never imagined being intellectually challenged by a child, let alone spiritually stirred by one. But Yusuf's words echoed. Maybe the real contradiction is that we keep fighting over who owns the truth instead of recognizing the truth that owns us. Rosen tried to ground himself in rebuttal, something sharp, something final. Then almost mechanically he leaned toward the microphone. You say Islam respects the Torah, he said slowly, his tone more cautious now. But if your book is so complete, why does it refer to God as we? Doesn't that contradict your claim of pure monotheism? The question was meant to trip him. It had worked on many before. But Yusuf only smiled gently. In Arabic, as in Hebrew, he said, there is something called the royal plural. Kings and rulers use we to refer to themselves not because they are many, but because their status is high. He paused, looking up directly at the rabbi. It's not a number. It's a reflection of majesty. The room stilled. The rabbi's face didn't move, but his shoulders sank just slightly. Yusuf continued, the Torah also uses it in Genesis. Let us make man in our image. We do not say there are many gods. We say that God is beyond the singularity of numbers. His oneness is unique, not mathematical divine. There was no arrogance in his voice, just light, the kind that doesn't blind but reveals. The rabbi let out a breath. He hadn't realized he was holding it. He looked at the crowd. They weren't judging him. If anything, they seemed to be waiting for something, hoping he would listen. He turned back to Yusuf. You speak as if you've lived a lifetime with this book. Yusuf nodded slowly. I've only lived 10 years, but I read it every day with my grandfather. He told me, you will forget many things in life. Don't let the Quran be one of them. The rabbi closed his eyes for a moment. He remembered his own grandfather, his voice trembling over a candle-lit Torah scroll, whispering, study this not to win, but to understand. That memory struck like a match inside his chest. Something long buried, flickered. Ego tried to reassert itself. He was the scholar here, the voice of authority. But the room didn't care about titles anymore. They cared about the truth they could feel. And that truth today had come from a boy with wide eyes and a sacred book held gently in his hand. Rosen straightened, cleared his throat, and tried one last time. If you honor Moses, then why not follow him? Why follow Muhammad instead? Yusuf took a breath and answered with a line that would later be quoted around the world. Because when a new teacher is sent by the same school, you do not betray the first. You continue the lesson. The audience gasped, not in disbelief but in recognition. Even the rabbi smiled. It wasn't defeat. It was the first step towards surrendering pride. The air in the synagogue felt different now, not heavy, not tense, but still. Like something sacred had descended quietly and refused to leave. The crowd no longer looked at Yusuf with disbelief or amusement. They looked at him the way one looks at something rare, something that might vanish if you breathe too loud. Rabbi Rosen leaned back slowly in his chair. His shoulders, once rigid with defense, now rested with visible weariness. He had come here prepared to crush a flawed doctrine, to defend tradition, to make clear that the Torah stood alone in divine truth. But the boy, this 10-year-old child, had not only held his ground, he had softened it. Yusuf waited patiently. He never pressed, he didn't gloat, he simply stood there like a lamp left on in a dark room. The rabbi finally spoke this time, not to challenge but to ask, "Do you believe your prophet loved Moses?" Yusuf nodded without hesitation. Yes, deeply. He cried when he heard his story. He called him brother, and he said, "We are closer to Moses than even his own people because we follow his path of surrender to God." The rabbi swallowed. Yusuf stepped forward carefully as if not to disturb the reverence that now hung between them. "Rabbi," he said, "if Moses returned today, do you think he would argue with a people who prayed like he prayed, fasted like he fasted, and worshiped the same one God he worshiped?" Rosen opened his mouth to respond but stopped. Something caught in his throat, or Yusuf continued gently. "Would he recognize us not as rivals, but as companions on the same road?" Tears welled quietly in the rabbi's eyes. It wasn't embarrassment, it was remembrance. He looked down at the table before him at the Torah resting near his hand, and then up at Yusuf. "I've spent my life defending truth," he said, voice cracking. "But somewhere along the way, I forgot to seek it." A silence followed, but it wasn't empty. It was full. The kind of silence that holds 100 unspoken prayers. Then the unexpected happened. Rabbi Rosen stood up. The audience murmured in confusion, then fell quiet again. He walked down from the stage and approached Yusuf, stopping just a few feet away. Slowly, he lowered himself onto one knee so they were eye to eye. "I don't know what your destiny is, Yusuf," he said, voice trembling. "But today, you reminded me that truth doesn't always come with age." Yusuf blinked. "Truth doesn't need age, Rabbi," he said softly. "It just needs sincerity." A woman in the back wept openly. A man beside her whispered Baruch Hashem. The moderator, overwhelmed, covered his mouth with one hand, and the rabbi. He reached forward and gently touched the edge of Yusuf's Quran. "Would you teach me what it says about Moses?" Yusuf smiled and nodded. The crowd, frozen in awe, didn't need applause. They had witnessed something far greater than victory. They had witnessed a heart opened not by argument, but by truth wrapped in humility. And in that moment, a rabbi and a Muslim boy stood together, not as opponents in a clash of religions, but as two seekers of the same light. The image of Rabbi Eliam Rosen kneeling before a 10-year-old Muslim boy spread across the world like a spark in dry grass. What had started as a routine interfaith dialogue had transformed into something timeless, a living parable about humility, listening in the unexpected places truth sometimes chooses to speak from. Clips from the event flooded social media, the rabbi's trembling voice, Yusuf's calm smile. The Quran held gently between them. One caption read, "A boy didn't win a debate. He opened a door." In the days that followed, the synagogue received thousands of messages. Some came in anger, others in awe, but the most powerful ones were quiet. "I never knew Muslims honored Moses. I watched this with my daughter. We cried together. I've stopped hating what I never truly tried to understand." Rabbi Rosen did not return to public lectures for several weeks. Instead, he withdrew, not out of shame, but reflection. In a private message later released to his congregation, he wrote, "I debated a child thinking he had only memorized words, but I found in him a mirror. He reminded me that the Torah is not a weapon to win arguments, but a light to recognize truth, even when it shines through another's window." Meanwhile, Yusuf returned to his quiet life. He never once asked to be praised or filmed. When asked by a journalist how he stayed so calm, he replied, "My grandfather told me if you speak for Allah, let your voice carry His mercy, not your pride." At school, his classmates now looked at him differently, not with mockery but respect. A few even asked if they could read the Quran with him. One afternoon, Rabbi Rosen came to visit Yusuf's home. He brought with him a Hebrew Bible worn with age and handed it to the boy. "This one," he said, "was my father's. It taught me to love the prophets, but today you taught me to listen to them again." Yusuf opened the Torah reverently. "Shall we read it together?" he asked. The old man smiled. Yes, and then your book too. They sat across from each other, teacher and student, and yet neither fully one nor the other. There were no cameras, no applause, just pages turning, just hearts returning. And though no formal conversion ever followed, many whispered that Rabbi Rosen was no longer the same man. He didn't need a new religion. He had recovered something more rare, his sincerity. Years later, people would remember that day, not for controversy, but clarity. Not because someone won a debate, but because someone laid down their armor to hear what they had always feared: the other side's humanity. And in quiet homes across Jerusalem, young children were told the story of a boy named Yusuf, who carried a book too big for his hands and a truth too deep for many adults to understand. A truth that said, if you walk with humility, truth will meet you halfway. And when it does, it may not come from a scholar's lips, but from a child's. The story of the rabbi and the boy who knew the book teaches us that truth is not bound by age, title, or tradition. It is carried by those who approach it with humility. In a world that often glorifies intellect over sincerity and status over substance, this narrative reminds us that the most profound wisdom can come from the softest voice. Yusuf, a young boy, didn't argue to conquer. He spoke to connect. His calm, respectful manner disarmed ego, and his sincerity awakened hearts. The rabbi, though a scholar, found himself relearning the meaning of truth, not through rebuttal, but through recognition. This story challenges each of us to examine how we listen, how we respond to those we disagree with, and whether our search for truth is driven by pride or by purpose. In your life, you may find yourself confronted by those who misunderstand you or your beliefs. But know this dignity: knowledge and sincerity speak louder than anger ever could. Real change doesn't come from shouting the loudest, but from speaking with light. When you carry truth with humility, you don't just win arguments, you open hearts. And that, in the end, is the most lasting kind of victory. He built his career mocking Islam, millions of followers, viral debates, aggressive thumbnails. This was supposed to be his biggest takedown yet. The cameras rolled, the crowd laughed. A teenage Muslim sat quietly across from him. And then, something no one expected happened. The teen didn't argue. He didn't flinch. He answered with calm clarity and truth. And within minutes, the YouTuber who came to destroy Islam was crying on stage. Not in defeat, but in realization. He looked into the camera and said, "I was wrong." What did this young Muslim say that changed everything you're about to witness? The moment pride broke and a heart opened. If you're ready for the truth behind the thumbnail, press 1 to begin. The thumbnail was brutal. Lucas Grady's signature grin overlaid with bold text: Islam on trial. Watch me end. This religion live. Within minutes, it hit trending. Lucas wasn't just a YouTuber. He was a self-made internet provocateur. Thousands followed his live debate streams, not for nuance, but for takedowns. His fans called him the atheist exposer. His enemies called him arrogant. Either way, he had an audience, and tonight he was going viral again. The auditorium filled quickly, ring lights, live stream crew sponsors on banners, and a loud crowd eager for blood. Lucas stood backstage adjusting his mic, laughing with his tech guy. "This'll be easy, I've debated doctors. This guy's just a college kid." He glanced at his opponent's bio one last time. Ammar Khan, 18, student of comparative religion, youth coordinator at a local masjid. No publications, no big titles, no reputation. Lucas scoffed. He won't last 10 minutes. The host's voice rang out. "Please welcome Lucas, Grady, and Ammar Khan." To the stage, Lucas entered like a showman, waving. The crowd clapped, cheered, some whistled. He soaked it in, pulling his mic closer like a rock star. Then Ammar walked in. No swagger, no fanfare, just a quiet, composed teenager in a navy hoodie and clean white kufi. He walked to the podium without looking left or right, placed a small, worn Quran beside his notes, and waited. The contrast was striking. Lucas began with a grin. "Welcome, folks. Tonight, we're not here to fight, we're here to fact-check faith." Laughter followed. Ammar smiled lightly. "And I'm here to speak the truth with respect." Lucas raised an eyebrow. "We'll see how long that lasts." The tension began building instantly. The crowd leaned in. They thought they knew what was coming, but no one. Not Lucas, not the audience, not even the cameras was ready for how this debate would end. Lucas leaned into his mic, fingers tapping rhythmically on his debate desk. "Let's not waste time," he said to Ammar. "If Islam is really the religion of peace, then why is there so much violence in Muslim countries? Terrorism, Sharia, punishments, women forced to cover. If that's peace, I'd hate to see war." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Ammar didn't flinch. He nodded once, as if he'd been waiting for this exact moment. "Do you believe Christianity is false because some Christians have committed war crimes?" he asked gently. Lucas blinked. "Or do you blame the individuals, not the scripture?" The laughter faded slightly. Ammar continued calm and composed. "Islam is not defined by the worst of its followers, just like any other faith. The Quran commands justice, mercy, and peace. Yes, some violate those commands. That's not the religion's failure. That's human failure." Lucas leaned back, lips tight. "Okay," then he said, trying to recover. "Let's talk about women. Why does Islam force women to cover themselves? Why do they need to be hidden?" Ammar's eyes scanned the room. He didn't rush. "I was raised by a woman who wears hijab," he said. "She's a doctor, a mother, a leader. She covers herself because she chooses dignity over display. Islam doesn't hide women, it honors them." He looked directly at Lucas. "In a world where women are pressured to expose more to be seen, Islam says you are already enough." A low murmur passed through the audience. A few young women in hijab in the front row sat up straighter. Lucas's expression darkened slightly. "Right modesty equals oppression." Ammar shook his head. "True oppression is when society tells a woman she's only valuable if she's visible. Hijab rejects that silence." Lucas tapped his papers, flipping to the next page. "Then let's try scripture. The Quran, full of contradictions. Tell me, why does it say there's no compulsion in religion and then talk about fighting unbelievers?" Ammar didn't blink because context matters, he said. "The verse about fighting was revealed during war, when Muslims were being attacked, exiled, and killed. The command was to defend, not to conquer." He quoted calmly, "If they incline toward peace, you must also incline toward it." Quran 8:61. "And there is no compulsion in religion" is a timeless principle. No verse contradicts that. It clarifies the conditions around war, peace, and justice. For a moment, even the crew behind the cameras looked up from their monitors. Lucas, gripping his pen tighter, now tried to strike again. "Why did your prophet marry multiple women? Isn't that immoral?" Ammar raised a brow gently. "Did you ask that same question of Solomon, Abraham, or Jacob?" Lucas froze. Ammar leaned in slightly. "Prophet Muhammad married for reasons of compassion, widows, alliances, protection, not lust. And unlike biblical prophets, not once does the Quran accuse him of sin with women." Lucas stayed silent. Ammar folded his hands. "You keep asking questions as if Islam has something to hide. But Islam isn't hiding. It's here. It's always been here. And truth doesn't run from questions, it invites them." The room was shifting, not just in noise, but in energy. The crowd that had come for a spectacle now sat in quiet awe. Lucas looked at his list of killer questions, suddenly feeling the weight of every word he hadn't thought would be answered. He had come to expose Islam, but it was his certainty that was starting to crack. By now, even the laughter had stopped. Lucas sat behind his desk, posture tightening with every passing moment. His signature sarcasm, once a weapon, was losing its edge. His fingers hovered uncertainly above his keyboard of notes, but his audience, live and online, was already beginning to drift in a different direction. Ammar, meanwhile, remained centered. He wasn't performing, he wasn't reacting, he was simply answering, and people were beginning to notice. In the second row, a woman in a burgundy headscarf wiped the corner of her eye. She hadn't come expecting dignity. She had come expecting damage, but now she felt proud. Seen, heard. In the back, a young man in a leather jacket, who had come just to heckle, now leaned forward with his elbows on his knees, listening intently. And somewhere in the crowd, even one of Lucas's longtime fans quietly turned off his phone. Not because the show was boring, but because he suddenly felt conflicted. Lucas tried to reset the energy. "Let's stop playing word games," he said with a forced chuckle. "You talk like a politician, not a prophet's follower. Islam still preaches superiority, doesn't it? Muslims believe they're better than everyone else? Ammar looked directly at him. No, he replied calmly. Muslims are commanded to be better in character, not better than others. He opened the Quran beside him. It says the most honored in the sight of God is the one most righteous. Shudwan, not the wealthiest, not the most famous, not even the Muslim, just the one who fears God and does good. A quiet gasp traveled through the room. Islam doesn't promote arrogance, Ammar continued. It destroys it. It humbles the soul before the one who created all souls equally. He looked up, that includes you. The air tightened. Even Lucas didn't have a retort ready. The host sitting off to the side blinked. He had moderated dozens of debates, but he'd never seen one tilt this way, this naturally without force. Lucas chuckled nervously, trying to recover. All right, he said, pulling out a printed meme from his folder, a well-known out-of-context quote falsely attributed to the Prophet. He waved it toward the audience. How do you defend this? Ammar glanced at it and then simply said, that's fake, fabricated, not even accepted by Muslim scholars. Try again. A burst of laughter came not from mockery this time, but from surprise. A group of university students clapped lightly in the back. Lucas's smile twitched. He'd lost the room, but worse, he was starting to lose himself. His eyes glanced at the camera feed behind the tech crew. The live stream was still going strong. Comments were flooding in, but they weren't what he expected. This Muslim kid is wrecking him respectfully. Wow, I came to hate now. I'm curious. He's not debating. He's teaching. Lucas looked down at his questions, the same ones he had used in dozens of debates, and for the first time, they looked empty. Ammar, seeing the shift, leaned forward. You know, he said quietly, you came to expose Islam. But what if Islam is here to expose something in you? Lucas looked up, startled. The question wasn't accusatory. It was sincere, almost caring. The crowd held its breath, and for the first time in his YouTube career, Lucas had no line ready, no quip, no shield, just silence. And the sound of his own walls beginning to crack, Lucas lowered his gaze. His fingers stopped moving. His notes sat untouched. The confident persona he had carried into the room like armor was unraveling quietly, painfully. The lights still shone, the camera still rolled. The audience still watched, but the war had shifted from the stage to within him. Ammar didn't press, he just waited. The silence between them was no longer awkward, it was surgical. It was slicing through the ego, not for spectacle, but for truth. Lucas started, his voice catching. I've done over 200 debates. Ammar stayed quiet. I always came in with a plan, a punchline. I studied every contradiction I thought I'd find. He looked up slowly, but no one ever answered me like this. Not like you. The audience listened, stunned. No one expected a confession. Lucas swallowed hard. Last year, I watched a clip of a Muslim feeding a man who had cursed him. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Then I found more videos, your lectures, others like you. I was curious, but I buried it under sarcasm. I invited you here thinking I'd break Islam on camera. His hands trembled slightly on the table. But now I realize I didn't bring you here to destroy Islam. He looked straight at Ammar. I brought you here because I was afraid it might be true. The room went still. The crowd had come for content. What they were witnessing now was confession. Ammar's expression didn't change, except for a slight softening in his eyes. He wasn't surprised, he'd seen this before. Not often, but enough to know when the heart was losing its war with pride. Truth, Ammar said quietly, isn't supposed to comfort your ego. It's supposed to free your soul. Lucas exhaled shakily, his voice barely audible. What do I do with this feeling? Ammar leaned in slightly. Let it break you. Lucas blinked. Sometimes, Ammar continued. You have to let the walls fall before the light can get in. The Quran didn't come to dominate, it came to liberate. Even the Prophet wept when the truth came down. It's okay if you do too. Lucas tried to hold it in, but he couldn't. His shoulders collapsed inward as he placed his hands over his face. And right there on camera in front of thousands, Lucas Grady, the internet's most confident critic of Islam, began to cry, not out of defeat, but out of relief. No one moved. No one laughed, no one spoke. Even online, the chat slowed. Viewers who had come to ridicule were now typing messages like, "I've never seen anything like this. This is the realest thing I've ever watched. God, guide him." Lucas wiped his face, breath shaky. "I'm not ready to believe everything. Not yet, but I don't want to fight anymore. I want to understand." Ammar nodded with compassion. "That's the first step." At the back of the auditorium, an imam who had remained seated quietly the entire time stood and walked slowly forward. The crowd parted for him as if they knew something was about to shift. He placed a hand on Lucas's shoulder. "When the heart opens," he said gently, "Allah is never far." Lucas looked up. The light hit his face differently now, not harsh like a spotlight, but soft, almost forgiving. He didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. His silence was no longer resistance. It was surrender. The stage, once a battleground of words, had turned into a sanctuary of stillness. The imam's hand remained firm on Lucas's shoulder, grounding him as his tears continued. Tears not of embarrassment, but of something unfamiliar. Released for years, Lucas had thrived on control over conversations, over narratives, over perception. But now, for the first time, he wasn't scripting the moment. He was simply living it. "I spent so long pretending," Lucas whispered, "pretending I knew better, pretending I had all the answers. But inside, I was drowning." He looked out at the audience. "I mocked your faith. I clipped your scholars out of context. I made a living by lying to myself." The audience was dead silent. Ammar stood beside him, still saying nothing. There was no need to. This wasn't about winning anymore. This was about witnessing. Lucas turned to the imam. "What if—" He paused. "What if I want to learn for real, not for content, just for clarity?" The imam smiled softly. "Then you are already on the path. Allah guides whom He wills. All you need now is sincerity." Ammar stepped forward gently. "You don't have to have all the answers today. Just be honest with yourself. That's where I started too." Lucas nodded slowly, processing every word. Then unexpectedly, he turned toward the microphone, cleared his throat, and spoke directly to the live stream audience. To everyone watching, he began. "You've followed me for years. You've laughed with me, debated with me, praised me, criticized me." His voice trembled slightly. "But today I won't be your performer. I won't be your hero. I won't be your atheist idol." He took a breath. "I'm just a man who saw the truth when a young Muslim boy showed me what Islam actually is." Somewhere in the live stream chat, a flood of shocked emojis appeared, then got buried beneath messages like, "This is powerful. I never expected this. Subhanallah, guide him, Ya Allah." Lucas looked down at the desk that once held his gotcha questions. Slowly he pushed them aside, then quietly he stood up. "I don't know where this road ends," he said, "but if Islam is what I felt today, then I want to walk toward it." A hush passed through the crowd like wind through a forest. No clapping, no shouting, just reverence. The imam looked at Lucas with compassion. "Would you like to say the Shahada?" Lucas hesitated, his hands trembling. His eyes darted across the audience, the lights, the cameras. For a moment, doubt flickered across his face. "I'm not ready," he said. "Not yet, but I want to learn. I want to study. I want to come back. Not with a challenge, but with a heart ready to receive." The imam nodded. "Then may Allah increase your sincerity. When the heart opens, the rest follows." Lucas slowly stepped back from the mic. And Ammar, he walked over gently, placing a hand on Lucas's back, not to lead him, but to stand with him. Because this wasn't about destination anymore. It was about direction, and everyone in that hall, everyone behind the screen had just witnessed something far more powerful than a debate. They had witnessed a beginning. The lights had not dimmed, the cameras hadn't stopped rolling, and yet it felt like time itself had paused. The crowd, once restless and entertained, now sat still, frozen in reverence. The story had shifted. What began as a live stream clash was now unfolding as something far more sacred. Lucas stood slightly apart from the podium, head bowed, hands clenched. He was no longer the showman, no longer the skeptic. He was just a man broken open in public, holding questions he once buried beneath sarcasm, Ammar walked to his side, quietly offering no pressure, only presence. Behind them, the imam remained calm. "You've taken the first step," he said gently. "You've acknowledged the stirring in your heart. That's not small. That's not weakness. That's fitra, your soul returning to its origin." Lucas looked up, his voice cracked. "I thought belief was blindness. I spent years mocking faith like it was a disease." He looked at Ammar, eyes glistening. "But the way you answered, the way you carried yourself, it wasn't weakness, it was truth, Ammar. And it's like, my heart recognized it before my mind did." Ammar smiled, his voice soft. "Because Islam doesn't need to conquer the intellect, it just needs to awaken the soul." Lucas nodded. "I don't want to play with this anymore. I don't want to debate for views or question for attention. I want to know, really know." The imam stepped forward. "If you are ready," he said, "you can begin that journey by testifying what your heart already leans toward, that there is no God but Allah, and that Muhammad is his messenger." Lucas froze. The words hovered in the air like a bridge stretching out before him. He looked at the audience. Some were silently weeping. Others were praying beneath their breath. This was no longer content. This was a crossroads. Lucas exhaled, his voice trembling. "I'm scared." The imam nodded. "That's normal, but do not confuse fear with falsehood. Fear often shows up when truth is near." Lucas blinked slowly, tears beginning to fall. Then finally he whispered, "Ashhadu, alla ilaha illallah." The room gasped. "Wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah." Silence broke like a dam, sobs rose from unexpected corners. The tech crew clapped, tears streaming. Even some of Lucas's longtime followers in the back stood stunned, hands over their hearts. Ammar stepped back, eyes misty, overwhelmed with quiet joy. Lucas stood there shaking, weeping but free. Years of mockery, pride, and confusion had lifted like fog, burned away by morning light. The imam embraced him, whispering a quiet dua in his ear. "Allah has chosen you. Your sins are forgiven. Today you are like a newborn." Lucas couldn't stop crying. "I don't deserve this," he whispered. Ammar approached, gripping his hand. "None of us deserve it. That's why it's mercy." The stage, once decorated for a showdown, now felt like holy ground. No more talking, no more tactics, only hearts and a new beginning. In that moment, the live stream title was changed in real time by a staff member watching everything unfold. It no longer read "Islam on trial." It now read, "He came to destroy Islam." But it set him free. The live stream ended, but the story had only begun. The title, "He came to destroy Islam," but it set him free, spread across YouTube like wildfire. Within an hour, clips of Lucas reciting the Shahada appeared on TikTok, Twitter, and Instagram. But unlike the viral videos that came before this, one didn't explode with mockery. It spread with silence, with reverence, with truth. Muslims around the world watched in tears. Atheists paused in reflection. Former fans of Lucas sent messages, not of outrage, but of astonishment. "I don't know what just happened. That wasn't a debate. That was a divine moment. I need to rethink everything." But while the internet churned in real-time transformation, Lucas himself sat quietly backstage, wrapped in a white prayer shawl someone had offered him. His face was still wet with tears. His phone buzzed non-stop, but he didn't touch it. He just sat, head-lowered, hands shaking, heart beating differently. Ammar joined him silently, sitting cross-legged beside him. No words needed, no congratulations, just presence. After a long while, Lucas broke the silence. "I thought this moment would feel like defeat," he said, "but I've never felt more alive." Ammar smiled. "That's because you didn't lose. You let go." Lucas looked up, his voice soft. "I don't know how to pray yet. I don't even know how to live as a Muslim." "You don't have to know everything today," Ammar replied. "Islam isn't about perfection, it's about intention, and you've already made the most sincere one of all." Just then, the imam entered with 2 small books in hand, a translated Quran and a beginner's guide to prayer. He handed them to Lucas. "Start here," he said, "and stay close to those who remind you of Allah." Lucas took the books like they were treasure. As the night wrapped up, most of the audience quietly made their way out. many lingering in the halls, still dazed by what they had witnessed. A few came up to shake Lucas's hand. Some simply said, "Thank you." A young woman stopped Amr at the exit. "I'm not Muslim," she said, "but I've never heard Islam spoken with that much clarity. I'm going to read the Quran now. I have to." Amr nodded, humbled. That's how it starts. Later that week, Lucas's channel rebranded entirely. The old thumbnails were taken down. The aggressive clickbait was replaced with quiet sincerity. His first new upload was titled, "I Found Something I Can't Ignore: My Journey to Islam." It wasn't flashy. It didn't scream for attention, and yet within 48 hours, it had over 5 million views. Because this time, the truth wasn't edited, it was lived behind the scenes. Lucas texted Amr late one night, "I still have so many questions, but I feel peace now when I say Allah's name." "That's new," Amr replied. "That's not new. Brother, that's your soul remembering its source." And as the world continued turning busy, chaotic, loud, one quiet video, one simple debate, and one unexpected act of surrender continued changing hearts across the globe. Not because it proved Islam, but because it showed it. This story reminds us that sometimes the most profound truths emerge not through confrontation, but through humility. The YouTube debate that went wrong or right isn't just about a viral moment. It's about the journey from arrogance to awakening. Lucas began with confidence fueled by ego and the need for applause. But when confronted with calm sincerity and unwavering truth, his heart began to soften. Amr didn't try to win a debate. He simply embodied Islam with patience, clarity, and dignity. That quiet strength shattered pride more effectively than any argument could. In life, we often cling to certainty and resist ideas that challenge our worldview. But this story teaches us that real growth begins when we stop trying to be right and start being sincere. When we listen without the intent to refute and speak without the need to dominate, hearts can open. Whether you're Muslim or not, the lesson is universal. Truth doesn't need aggression, it needs honesty. And healing doesn't come from proving others wrong. It comes from being courageous enough to admit when we've been wrong ourselves. Let your pride fall if it means your soul can rise. That's how transformation begins.